So, now you've decided to take the plunge to Linux, and you're now using it as your daily OS. But there's one problem: you cannot run the Windows-specific software natively in Linux, either because it's not supported on Linux, or is not able to run in a compatibility layer such as Wine. So what is the solution to that, you may ask? Virtual machines, of course. With Oracle's VirtualBox, or the other popular alternative VMware Workstation or VMware Player, these virtual managers make it very easy to set up multiple operating systems inside your host OS, regardless of the operating system you run. But the only one I mentioned that supports many OSs is VirtualBox. VMware does not work on Mac or Linux in some cases. The workstation is Windows and Linux only, and Parallels is a Mac-specific VM manager, and others such as QEMU are too fiddly and difficult to get working, especially if you're an always user. So this is why I like VirtualBox most. You may like something else, but from what I know, most of my viewers also use VirtualBox, so that's why I make most tutorials surrounding that specific application. Anyway, it's really easy to run Windows and Linux. You can run anything, from Windows 1.0, all the way to Windows 11, soon to be Windows 12, so it's got you covered. Although I mostly use it to run XP 7, I also run 8.1 on the odd occasion, but rarely ever install 10 or 11, because I find the legacy systems work better than Windows 10 or Windows 11, although you can run any Windows version you want. But if you rely on having the latest software, it's not a bad idea to go with the supported version of Windows. Windows 8.1 and older are getting less and less software support as time goes by, although many free and open source applications still work on them. A lot even still works on XP, believe it or not. But let's say you need the latest version of Sony Vegas Professional, or something like that, then you're going to also need to have a supported version of Windows for that program, right? Because most programs nowadays require 10 as a bare minimum, and it must be 22H2 as well. So whatever version you decide to go with, be sure it suits your needs. Virtual machines provide a very convenient and easy way to access Windows software on Linux and other Unix-like systems, because not every software out there works on Mac OS or Linux. So the people using those other systems must have a way of being able to run the software they need, if that need arises. However, it's also not a bad idea to look at free alternatives. For example, if you cannot use Photoshop on Linux for whatever reason, then just go with GIMP. It's a freaking awesome free and open source alternative to Photoshop. No price tag, and it has everything you could want, unless of course you needed the advanced features of Photoshop. But if you don't, then GIMP will do you just fine. I should also mention there are a number of amazing programs I have mentioned in previous videos, showing you free alternatives to paid for proprietary software. So go check those videos out if you're interested, because when you move to Linux, sacrifices must be made, sadly to say, but you must adjust to using free stuff for pretty much everything you do. Thank God there is a plethora of FOSS software these days. A lot of it does a great, if not better job than the paid-for or proprietary equivalents, and most Linux distributions have software centers, so you can easily find what you need most of the time. However, I often find looking on the web to also be great, especially if the software you're looking for is not available via the software center on your specific distro. Not all distros have great software managers. Anyway, it's also important to note that even the best free equivalents can't always do what you need. So in some cases, a Windows PC would be great to have on hand. However, if you prefer having two OSs on the one PC, it's not a bad idea to do a dual drive boot, but unfortunately, risks are there and they can be devastating. For instance, Windows Update might corrupt or overwrite your master boot record, MBR for short, so this will disable you from being able to boot into Linux. The same thing goes vice versa. But this most often happens because of Windows updates, so if you do decide to do a dual boot, I advise you consider the consequences seriously, and see what best fits you, because for some people, it might be better just to run Linux, but if you need Windows, and a VM does not meet your demands, then obviously, you will need access to a physical system. A cloud PC running Windows in the cloud is also a doable thing, but this is the least feasible option. Since we're looking at free stuff, this is not free. It costs a fortune, and it can only be accessed online. Plus, you do not have a system powerful enough to be worthy of running demanding software. So a cloud PC has some major disadvantages to locally managed virtual machines, but for all intensive purposes, if you need Windows software, then the best thing to do is to either set up a dual boot, or have a separate PC that already has Windows on it, so you can retain access to your software no matter what. Let me share a little something here though. I honestly never wanted to go back to Windows on my main PC, so I took the other hard drive out, and from that day onward, I have never used it since. I have been able to do away with all this amazing free and open source software, and I do not think I will ever need Windows again. I am willing to stay with Linux for as long as I can, because there are so many things about it that I prefer over proprietary systems. Plus, it really brings new life to an older PC or laptop. I know this because both an old laptop I had and my current PC have both been better using Linux. I used Ubuntu on the old laptop, which I no longer have sadly. I use Mint daily on my current PC, so this goes to show you that it is a usable system for daily tasks, but in a lot of cases, people just don't want to learn something different, so the masses stay with Windows. Even Mac has nothing by comparison. 20% is a fair bit, but it's way smaller than Windows, and Linux, well, it's basically a measly 3%, but for the Linux community, that's a milestone since reaching 2% many years ago, so that's nice to see. But for all intensive purposes, Linux ain't going to get mass adoption for migration, but rather, people will just keep using Windows, and only geeks, nerds, enthusiasts, and people who have too much time on their hands are the only ones who will ever use Linux, or even BSD for that matter. So while Linux is a great OS that has so much freedom and variety for you, the user, you also have to deal with the fact that a lot less supports it, and even running VMs is not always the best option, as this requires a decent PC with 8 GB of RAM or more, and not everyone has a powerful enough PC. There are plenty of poor people out there, and when Windows 10 comes to the graveyard in October of 2025, billions of people will be in a difficult situation. Do they upgrade to the newest version of Windows, or use a different OS? Businesses particularly suffer greatly when things like this happens. In fact, many places in Australia still run Windows 7, and yet, that's one of the richest countries on earth. Many other places, including China, also use Windows 7, but to a larger extent. About 25% over there run it, and Armenia uses Windows XP to this very day. About 70% of PCs over there still use this operating system. That's a real worry for the people over there, and no matter how good Linux is, people just don't want to bother with it, either because they think it's really hard, which it honestly is not. Unless it's the first time you're using it maybe, and don't know any commands, but other than that, Windows has the monopoly, so you will have to make the end decision of either staying with the mass, or using that tiny little thing on an island somewhere. That is the reality of this tech world we live in.